So I left off talking about reward deficiency as a potential genetic cause of addiction. Now, in the social science, we don't think just about genetics. We think about the social determinants of health and how psychosocial issues, neighborhood issues all contribute to someone's experience. So I don't want to get too much into the genetic thing, but it would be a disservice to talk about dopamine and not talk about some of the genetic links, because there really is strong science suggesting that dopamine deficiencies can be passed along a generational line. So in a private practice, one of the important questions that I ask people is, I want to know people's family history of addiction, right? Does anyone in your family have a history of drugs and alcohol? I want to know about eating disorders. I want to know about other weight-related issues. Those are really important questions so that I can understand, as I understand their psychology and their social circumstances, also get a picture of the biology. So when someone has dopamine deficits, and by the way, just to go back to how complicated it is, sometimes it means too little and sometimes it means too much. What you end up with is a lot more impulsivity. So impulsiveness is a key kind of characteristic of altered dopamine system. Impulsive means that there's a higher likelihood to act on a whim, to have very little foresight and consideration of the future consequences. So the part of the brain that does future consequences is the prefrontal cortex. So think about it. If the dopamine system back in the midbrain wants something and the front brain is like, nah, that ain't the move. Like, you better off not doing that and waiting because your life will be better, right? That would be a rational way of approaching it. People that are more impulsive will have that other part of the brain that wants what it wants, the reward, whether it be the food, the drink, the drugs, and it'll be able to kind of punk the front brain to get what it wants, right? So people that are impulsive, which means have very little kind of foresight into the future, it is often related to dopamine. And compulsive, which is different, means you do a behavior over and over again. So addiction is characterized by both impulsivity and compulsivity. Another important construct that I want to cover is called delay discounting. Delay discounting is when your brain is basically discounting future rewards for things right now. I see Patrice in the house. Thank you all for being here. Essentially, when someone gets the opportunity to get a big reward later, a lot of people will be able to say, yeah, I'm going to be patient. I'm going to wait for the big reward later. But if you have altered neurochemistry, it'll be really hard to do that because your reward systems will have learned that I want the thing now. I don't want to wait. I want it now, right? So they did an experiment with kids and they told them you can have one marshmallow now. These were 5-year-olds. Or you could have 2 marshmallows in 15 minutes if you can wait. And so the experiment was to see which types of kids were able to wait and which ones had just too much impulsivity and needed to take the marshmallow now. And they actually filmed it. So there's footage of how kids who were 5 managed this trade-off between the short term and the long term. So dopamine issues can be related to a higher level of delay discounting, which means people will make steep discounts on future rewards to have something in the more immediate moment, if that makes sense. So if you think about it, a lot of people want to change their eating behaviors. However, the food just tastes so good in the moment that it's really hard to say, you know what, I don't want to eat this because I want something greater. I want to stop eating at midnight, right? Or sex, for example. A lot of people mean to have protected sex, but it just feels so good in the moment that you can't really weigh the pros and the cons because the reward system is now running the show. So one other concept which is really important is called attentional bias. Attentional bias occurs when you've had an experience of something, you've been exposed to a salient reward, whether it be food, drugs, sex, etc. And because your brain has learned it, it's more likely to notice it, right? I hear people talking about balancing the dosing. Yes, right? Sometimes the dose is what really, really matters, right? And eating slower That's exactly right. There's a lot of things that you can do to improve the way the dopamine system works, and we'll talk about that kind of toward the end. Once we get a really good foundation of how it works, it's more clear what things we can do. And sometimes we have to fight to thrive in this world. I know me as a sober person, I have reward-related dysfunction, and I have to manage that. And I see Bobby's in the house. So attentional bias is an important concept that looks at how someone will be more likely to notice the things that they're already thinking about. So for example, two people could be driving down the street in the same car, and one person notices the Haagen-Dazs ice cream advertisement at the bus stop, and they can even notice it to where they see the condensation on the ice cream, right? Like that's what they noticed as they drove by. The other person in the car looked at the gas station and saw someone bending over, right? Because they're more thinking about sex per se. So what people have been exposed to informs what people notice per se. And that's called attentional bias. We're biased toward noticing what our brain has already learned. Now, I just want to make a couple points. Learning something doesn't always mean that it was a positive experience. So someone could have crystal meth one time and had a really bad experience with it, but the dopamine system still stores it as a good experience because the dopamine was high. Does that make sense? So it's more tricky than just like, was it a positive experience or a negative experience? A lot of people could go through the drive-thru and get, Carl's Jr. and have the food in the car and feel gross afterwards, but the dopamine response was so high that when they went by Carl's Jr. a week later, there was a signal that was like, yo, remember that experience? And you're like, yeah, I remember it. I didn't really like it, but for some reason, I want it, right? So this is the next big topic on dopamine. It's the difference between wanting and liking. This was a really huge breakthrough in the research world. If you Google it, you'll see a couple papers that have like 1,000 hits. Wanting versus liking. When I say hits, I mean citations in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. The wanting of something is the dopamine system, mostly. The brain learned it, so it creates the incentive to do it again. It creates the craving, and it creates the salience. So the want is different than the like. The like is the actual pleasure or the euphoria of something. So this involves the dopamine system, but it also involves, like I said before, the opioid system and the GABA system. So there's different parts of the brain that are responsible for the wanting of something and the liking of something. So when people get an addiction, what ends up happening is over time, the wanting of it goes up, but the liking of it goes down. Does that make sense? So you being exposed to a substance or a food per se that you're not really liking anymore, but you want it more than you used to, right? And these are tricks that the industry knows in order to maximize their profit and their experience selling products. They know that novel experiences increase the wanting of something. So if you do the same thing over and over again, I see Michelle's in the house. If you do something over and over again, the brain gets less and less dopamine from it. But as you move to a new experience, a novel experience, the dopamine spike goes up. So if you think about like Starbucks, they have the seasonal latte, or Carl's Jr. always has the new burger, right? There's always something that's got to be a little bit novel in order to make something not get dull. And this is also one of the reasons why sex addicts develop fetishes. You do the same thing kind of over and over again, and then right, it gets boring. You need to do something novel. You need a novel experience. Someone said McDonald's. Yes, there's always going to be a novelty-seeking part of addiction. So the major corporations know how the dopamine system works. They know that they want to find ways to increase someone's degree of wanting from something, and that they'll use novelty-seeking, attentional bias, right? They'll set up, images and cues that they actually have done research that activates the dopamine system. So, to start kind of recapping for those that joined, I've been talking about dopamine today as not just about a feel-good neurotransmitter, but as a teaching signal, is that dopamine teaches the brain what to do so that it can repeat the behavior again. And that is a very important thing that helps us thrive and survive when it comes to eating food, procreating, but it can easily become dysfunctional when the brain has learned things that are not survival promoting. Okay, so I heard an important researcher once talk about addiction as a learning disorder. So what ends up happening with addiction, whether it be food, sex, drugs, alcohol, is that it overlearns something based on the dopamine response. And once it's really learned that something is rewarding, even when you don't really like it so much, your brain will want it. And that's what addiction is in many ways. A couple other key points, and then maybe we'll get some questions going, is that the role of stress, trauma, and adversity are really important in addiction neuroscience as well as in relation to dopamine. So when someone is very stressed out or has a negative affect or negative emotions per se, the brain will look for something that can basically anesthetize that uncertainty or that kind of pain, or as we call it, negative affect. So part of what people learn from exposure to substances through dopamine is that a substance, food, caffeine, nicotine, sugar, will reduce negative affect. So where this becomes really interesting is that when people get really stressed, they'll turn to these things, right? We've always called it comfort eating, or right, like, predictable behavior. When I'm stressed, I smoke or whatever, but there's a neurochemical basis to it. Once the brain has learned that the dopamine reduces the stress and the adversity, it's going to signal for it when the stress and the adversity shows up. Does that make sense? Hopefully that's clear. It's a bi-directional thing. So people that get really stressed out turn to things that are dopamine stimulating to reduce the stress. And then when that sensation goes away and they don't have things that are rewarding, the body can create stress. So if you think about, if someone is going on a run on, let's say, cocaine for 5 days, when you stop doing cocaine, there's going to be a lot of stress. There's going to be a lot of negative affect and negative emotions. And the brain's going to know, oh, if you do this, that will make that go away. And that's one way that we understand the withdrawal cascade. Okay, a couple key kind of points as I start to wrap up. People want to know solutions, so hopefully I can offer a couple of solutions. Dopamine is, like I said, produced in the ventral tegmental area. There's also a large production of it in the gastrointestinal tract. The precursor to dopamine is amino acids that come from protein. So phenylalanine goes to tyrosine, which converts to dopamine. It's super unclear, if, having more of those amino acids will translate to more dopamine. And when I say by unclear is that there's a difference between dopamine production and dopamine stimulation, right? So there's been a trend towards amino acid therapy in the addiction world. There was once a treatment center that used the dopamine diet, right? And the theory was, if you eat more of the foods that have these neurotransmitters, you'll produce more dopamine, right? And there isn't a lot of evidence to support it. It's a really strong theory. More people are focusing on the gut now, knowing that about 50% of the body's dopamine is produced in the gut. But again, we talked about this a few weeks ago. It's unclear how gastrointestinal dopamine affects, the brain. So what I know to be true is that, for people that have any kind of dopamine related dysfunction, it's really important to find a balance and a sweet spot between exposure and, kind of staying away. Someone's asking about trauma. I'll come back to that if I can in a minute. And what I mean by that is, if you have a long history of any kind of addiction, or if there's been any stress or trauma and you've learned some dysfunctional behaviors that you go to, if you cut them all out completely, your brain's gonna feel a threat, okay? So if you take all their sources of dopamine away, remember we talked about survival? the brain registers it as a threat to survival. And that's why coming off substances are so hard. If someone's eating highly palatable food every single day and then they stop, the brain's going to be like, whoa, where's my dopamine, right? And if it's not getting dopamine, it registers it as a threat to survival, the same way if you think about our ancestors wouldn't be getting any food. The food supply now is filled with ingredients that are designed to spike optimal dopamine. And that's how, like I said, food companies are able to make so much money. Any kind of restaurant food is going to have more flavor, sugar, salt, oil than things people typically make at home. And they do that because if it's not more dopaminergic than the food that people make at home, they won't be motivated to go do it. Okay? So a lot of human behavior is predictable, in my opinion, by the dopamine response. Now, what I'll say about that is we can't really measure that. I see Andrew's in the house. We can't really measure the dopamine response. So a lot of this hasn't really been well described in the scientific literature. But I will say, and I'll just come out and say my opinion is that the dopamine response to certain things is a major predictor of human behavior. What activates the most dopamine is typically what someone is going to choose. Okay, without even knowing it. It's completely subconscious, right? The food that tastes a little bit better is going to be learned as the brain as a better choice because it gives a little bit more of a dopamine. And then you mix that with a little bit of stress and then a cue, right? An environmental cue, and people continue the behavior. And this is why it's so hard to change the way we eat, to quit smoking or vaping or any of those things. Because, a lot of it's governed by what I call underneath the hood, what's going on in our brain. So if you cut out all sources of dopamine, the brain's going to flip out. It's not going to be happy. It's not going to be okay. Now, what I suggest is that, you find sources of dopamine that are mild enough to where the brain doesn't throw a revolt, but not so much that you end up, getting into addiction cycles per se. So for example, if someone is, really addicted to energy drinks and eats, drinks 2 cups of coffee and 2 energy drinks a day, I typically wouldn't take them down to none. I would switch them over to, 1 cup of coffee and then green tea, right? For the first week. And then over time, as the dopamine from the caffeine comes down, you'd want to find other sources of dopamine. So for example, I see Liana's in the house. Someone's asking about, foods that produce serotonin. We're actually going to talk about serotonin in a future week or two. So I'm going to put that on hold. You wanna titrate people off high levels of dopamine and then find other life experiences that are rewarding. But life experiences, like for example, even doing this, right, is giving me a little bit of dopamine because I see people that I love. I'm able to talk about things that are exciting. It's a very minor dopamine release. It's rewarding enough to make me remember it, to want to do it again next week. But it's not the kind of dopamine release that I would get from, say, a milkshake per se. So when I help people to come off of the dopamine roller coaster, one of the key things is to not come completely off. Maybe there's a lot of dessert, right? They're binging on cakes and things every single night. You're going to want to find something that's mildly dopaminergic. You can't go from highly palatable foods to just the vegetable and protein diet. The brain will flip out, right? So you need to include things that are dopaminergic, but not so dopaminergic that it turns into addiction-like behaviors. Does that make sense? It's a very individualized strategy. So there isn't like a recommendation that I could make, but people that have dysfunctional behaviors need to find out their sweet spot. Like what's the right amount of something to do, okay? I know for me as a person in recovery, if I get into something and I'm starting to do it a lot, that can feel a little threatening per se. And everyone's different. So what works for me isn't going to work for someone. But thinking about dopamine and the dopamine response from substances and behaviors is a really important way to conceptualize behavioral change strategies, okay? Most people don't think about neurotransmitters and things because we don't know a lot about them. But once you know a little bit about the reward pathways and the way that the brain works, it becomes much more easy to conceptualize intervention strategies, to do maybe less of certain things that feel threatening, and to find the sweet spot to where your brain is satisfied, but not overexcited, okay? Now, the last thing that I'll make as a closing statement, and I really appreciate those that stayed the whole time. I see Amanda's in the house. This is a key point, right? The main lesson from the dopamine kind of talk today is that dopamine's not just about reward, it's also a teaching tool for the brain, okay? So the brain learns what's rewarding so that it can repeat the behavior. Now, the key message is that there's a difference between pleasure and happiness, okay? That's the key thing to understand for those of us that work with people who have addictions or eating disorders, or those of us that are in recovery ourselves. The pleasure part of the brain is mostly the dopamine system. Now, we find things that give us pleasure and we think that they make us happy, right? So when you eat the food that you love, or you drink the coffee that you love, we get this idea that that's what's creating happiness, when in reality, it's just creating neurochemical pleasure. Now, happiness is not really the dopamine system. Happiness is more of the serotonin system, which I'll talk about in a future week. Happiness comes from a sense of fulfillment, a sense of direction, a sense of purpose, a sense of connection with others, a sense of love, right? And those are the things that, a lot of people that get into addictions and dopamine things start to lack, which is why when someone's on a dopamine roller coaster and abusing substances, it's really critical once you get someone into recovery to get them moving towards a sense of purpose, developing passions, and figuring out other ways to make the brain satisfied without it being about activating the dopamine system. And that's a really challenging thing to do, and that's in many ways the art of recovery. Most people confuse and conflate pleasure and happiness. If people think if the sex is good, then it's definitely love. If the food tastes good, then I'm happy, right? But it's really important to know that pleasure is often coming from activation of dopamine. But if you overactivate your dopamine, guess what happens? It competes with the serotonin pathways and people end up less happy. And that's the balance that we need to find is, of course you want pleasure in your life, right? Everyone wants good food, great coffee, great sex. All those things are super important. But what's really important to make is a balance between pleasure and happiness, and not sacrifice our long-term happiness for more immediate pleasure. And that's the big trade-off between the short term and the long term. In the short term, my brain wants dopamine. It wants all the things that activate the dopamine system. It wants pleasure. It wants all those things. And I'm wired to do all those things at the expense of my long-term life goals, right? And what ends up happening, the trajectory of people with addictions is often that they end up really unhappy. People are depressed, right? You sought all these things in the short term, but you fail to consider the long haul. And I see the long haul coming in there. Great point, Natalie. Thank you. So what I encourage people to do, and what I'm trying to do personally in my own life, is to sacrifice some of the short-term, immediate pleasure-seeking behavior so that I could be in it for the long haul, so I don't burn out my neurons in my brain. I don't overactivate the dopamine system in my brain, so that when I'm 60, right, I have a sense of happiness because I haven't taxed myself. There's no biochemical free rides. Anything you do that's like going to overactivate something, there's going to be a cost for it down the line. And don't make that cost be the cost of your happiness, okay? And that's a really key, important point. You guys were awesome. I saw a question about trauma. I'll say one thing about trauma and the dopamine system. We talked last week about the biological embedding of adversity. Trauma can change someone's reward system so that they actually need more dopamine than the average person. And that's a really important thing. And I think the question was about attachment styles. Really good points about how people's social experiences can inform our need for dopamine experiences later. So what I'll say is that I'm in it for the long haul. I'm not doing any biochemical free rides. I'm not trading off my long-term goals for some short-term feeling of pleasure. A lot of what we can do to survive, can be calculated and strategic. But of course, sometimes we got to learn to go with the flow and seek pleasure in life. I think having pleasure in food is really important, and I do recommend that. No biochemical free rides. That's the one. Yeah. There's no such thing as getting over. It doesn't exist, right? You do some little hack, some little biohack, something that's gonna, soup you up, right? There's gonna be a cost in the long run. And I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. I just mean like pendulum always kind of swings back in the other direction. If anyone has a final question, I'll take it if I can answer it. This was super fun. We got cut out, but I came back and everyone was still there. That's really important. So moving forward, I'm just going to use my phone, not the platform that I tried to use. Couple people said a bad connection on your end. You know what? Last thing I'll say, the only kind of like addiction that I have currently is the internet. And when I'm addicted to high-speed internet, like as I'm online all day doing my work, and when my internet like stops working, I experience it as withdrawal. I swear to God, I'm like devastated. It's my dopamine system. I'm expecting a high sense of reward from what I'm doing, and when it stops, right? It's like devastating. And I just smile now. I'm like, oh, I know what that is. That's because my dopamine system has learned to expect reward. And when I don't get it, it throws a little revolt. So